Figures of speech we use all of the time. You say it's raining cats and dogs. Well, it's not literally raining cats and dogs. That would be like a science fiction horror movie. But figuratively, you're saying it's raining so hard that it's like cats and dogs, or it's raining buckets, or it's pouring rain, sort of like salt pouring, from a salt shaker, or water pouring from a pitcher. You're saying it's raining so much, it's like that. Um, in Forrest Gump, he says, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So life is very unexpected. You don't know if you're going to get a nut or a cream or a flavor that you like or you don't like. That's how it is. Poets use figurative language to describe the indescribable, grief or love or the mystery of death, all the mysteries that are involved and all the questions that we have and all the things that we don't like to look at or we're too busy to look at. Poets slow down and they look at things, but they're so hard to describe that they have to sometimes compare the thing they're trying to describe with something more physical that people can relate to. We might say, my freshman year was a roller coaster year. That doesn't mean you lived on a roller coaster or you went to the amusement park and went on roller coasters every day. You meant there was a lot of up and down, and there were some terrifying things and it was really exciting too. My daughter is the light of my life. Well, I still have to have electricity. I still have to pay the electric bill, right? You're saying she's so bright and wonderful. It's like a light. The video went viral. We hear that all the time, but videos don't literally go viral because they're not viruses. They're not like the flu. They're videos, but you're saying it. Whoever said that first was trying to communicate just how fast the video spread all around the country or the world. And it was really, really popular. So they say the video went viral. And those two V's, though, their video viral, make it memorable as well. So here's a famous saying from, or, English teacher geek famous. Carl Sandburg said, life is like an onion. You peel it off one layer at a time, and sometimes you weep. So he is trying to describe life, which is hard to describe, with something almost everybody has done, which is peeling an onion, and everybody knows, the aroma gets in your eyes and you might seem to weep a little bit. So there's two main types of figures of speech, the simile and the metaphor. And they're a lot alike in that they both compare one thing to another with the aim of, explaining it. But similes do it more upfront. They use comparing words. The words they use are like, as, seems, or appears. And if you see one of those words in your poem, look at that part of the poem. You have a simile. My love is like a red, red rose is a famous simile by the Scottish poet Robert Burns. And then Kay Ryan in our book on page 660, she has the simile. She's trying to describe a hailstorm. And she says a hailstorm is like a storm of hornets. Wow. If you've never been in a hailstorm, you can still see what she means by that. So those are similes where they use those comparing words. And if you don't use a comparing word, it's a metaphor, but it's still comparing two things. Have you ever heard the figure of speech? They wolfed down the food. In Battle Royale, Ralph Ellison describes the townspeople, the mayor and the leaders of the town. They're drunk and they're unpleasant to him. They're violent to him, and he describes them. They wolfed down the food. Well, they're not literally wolves, but they're eating like wolves. So the metaphor, you can unpack the metaphor and explain what it means. So a metaphor is like a simile, but it's a little more forceful and it has a different tone with it that I want you to try to pick up on. And notice how the poem by Kay Ryan that I just quoted, it moves from a simile to a metaphor. And if you're following along with the lecture, you can read from the beginning of the poem. She says, hailstorm, like a storm of hornets, the little white planets layer and unlayer. Relayer, I mean. Like a storm of hornets, the little white planets layer and relayer all around you. So she starts with a simile like a storm of hornets. The little white planets. Well, the hail is not literally planets, but she's saying they're like little white planets, but she doesn't say like, she just says it like a storm of hornets, the little white planets. And that metaphor jumps the reader in a way, in the same way that the hail does. It's like a forceful comparison. The little white planets layer and unlayer. And here we have another metaphor. A maelstrom, which is just a whirlpool in a sea or a river, a maelstrom spinning around. It's like a maelstrom. A maelstrom of ferocious little fists and punches. So that's the metaphor near the end of the poem, you know, and the hail is pretty forceful there, like it really is. So the language is forceful to go along with the forcefulness of a hailstorm. In the poem How Poetry Comes to Me by Gary Snyder, a real short one in our book on page 653, he uses a metaphor to explain what's pretty hard to explain, how a poem comes to him. And people probably kept asking him, you know, how did you, he's a well-known poet. How did you write that poem? How did it first come to you? You know, did you get up and sit down at your desk, or were you out walking and it came to you? So he tries to describe this mysterious, very personal process of how a poem hits him. And he says, it comes blundering over the boulders at night. It stays frightened outside the range of my campfire. I go to meet it at the edge of the light. So how many of you have been camping? And what happens when you hear a large sounding animal, maybe a bear, maybe a raccoon, you're not sure, you hear it just outside the edge of your light. It's a little bit scary. So you might run into your tent. But he says, that's not what I do when an idea for a poem comes to me, when a feeling to write about comes to me. I go to meet it at the edge of the light. So metaphors can lead us to, and especially the tone of the metaphor can lead us to the theme of the poem. And I would say the theme of that, if he goes out to meet this scary thing in the dark, is poetry. Maybe he's saying poetry takes courage. It takes courage to write it. And in that poem, besides having a metaphor, he extends the metaphor. He implies that a poem is like an animal out in the dark at the edge of your camplight. It's blundering over the boulders. It stays frightened outside the campfire. So he's extending the metaphor, meaning he's using it. He's harvesting as much as he can from that metaphor. Poetry is like an animal out in the woods. And notice when I just said he's harvesting, I made a metaphor to gardening, you know, which a lot of people can relate to. You've harvest the tomatoes when they're ripe or before the first frost comes. You go and gather them and you get all of them and bring them in. So I was saying he harvests the metaphor, he extends it as much as he can. And here's two other extended metaphors from the reading. In the Shane Koyczan poem, To This Day, we met him last week, The Crickets Have Arthritis, and I gave you a link to a video of the poem. He has this extended metaphor. He says, we are not abandoned cars stalled out and sitting empty on some highway. That's the metaphor. And it's, you know, the poem's about bullying and how we shouldn't believe and carry with us all those names and insults that the bullies laid upon us. We're not abandoned cars stalled out and sitting empty on some highway. And here's where he extends the metaphor. And if in some way we are, don't worry. We only got out to walk and get gas. So he extends the metaphor and gets as much out of it as he can. And in Sarah Kay's Ghost Ship, and there's a thread in the forum asking you to unpack a metaphor in that poem, which is full of metaphors. She keeps using ships in different ways. She says, today my brother is 20 years handsome. His decks have been worn down by the feet of others, but his compass always points north. So if he was a ship, he's kind of a beat up ship, she's saying, although 20 doesn't seem that old to me, but you know, maybe he's had a hard life. They had a divorce. His decks, their parents had a divorce. His decks have been worn down by the feet of others, but his compass always points north because a ship has a compass. So that's an extended metaphor. So as I said earlier, metaphors and similes create the tone, and that can help you figure out the poem and give you something to write about in your essay. What is the tone of this metaphor? And here's 3 love poems I want to give you with 3 metaphors that have really different tones. I already used My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose from Robert Burns, and here's the whole line. My love is like a red, red rose that early blooms in June. Now, what tone would you say that has? A sweet tone, a loving tone. You know, if there was a musical instrument that went with that, maybe a violin. My love is like a red, red rose. Now, here's another one from, I forgot his name, but it'll come back in a second. Pablo Neruda, South American poet. And it's a very short poem. Here's the whole poem. The title is Love Poem, and here's the whole poem. I want to do to you what spring does to the cherry trees. So what does spring do to the cherry trees? It causes them to blossom, and all at once. It's beautiful and amazing. And the aroma, if you've ever lived in a city that has a lot of cherry trees, you know when they bloom, it's amazing. So the tone, it's a love poem, and the tone of that is not loving and sweet so much as ecstatic, I think, and seductive. I want to do to you what spring, it's a little bit like a line on a first date, and feel free to use that. You can quote him, Pablo Neruda. And here's another one. It's also a short poem by Margaret Atwood. You fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, an open eye. Ooh, the tone gets kind of creepy there. At first, the metaphor, you could think hardware store, those kinds of hooks. You have the hook, and then you have the round one, and it fits into the hook like an eye to latch a screen door, say. But no, that's not what the metaphor is. A fish hook, an open eye. So at the end, we have a sarcastic, heavy tone, painful image, to imply, I guess, a not very good relationship. So metaphors, similes are 2 kinds of figurative language that you can discuss as you explicate your poem. And you also have, in almost every poem, you're going to have some imagery, which is simply descriptive language, usually vivid. If it's a good poem, it vividly describes something you would see or hear or touch or smell or even taste. I can't think of a poem that, as I was preparing this, I couldn't think of a poem that describes taste the imagery of taste. But if you can find something and send it to me, I can give you some bonus points. Most of the metaphors and similes I talked about include images in them. A fish hook, an open eye, you can see that. You could paint that if you were a painter, a fish hook in an open eye. So that's an image. So a lot of metaphors and similes are visual or auditory or olfactory, but not all images are metaphors. They could just be a description of a scene in a way that you can see it, and that's an image. And to illustrate imagery, I want to look at Jane Kenyon's poem, The Blue Bowl, which is in our book, and also it's on page 636 if you have the book open, and I hope you have the text for the lecture open. So I just want to read the whole poem and point out the imagery to you. Even the title, The Blue Bowl, is an image, not the bowl, but the blue bowl. And as soon as we hear cat, we can picture maybe plastic, a small bowl that, such as a lot of us have for our cats. So here's the poem. And if you click on the title in the text of the lecture, you can hear Jane Kenyon herself, the poet, read the poem. Like primitives, we buried the cat with his bowl. Bare-handed, we scraped sand and gravel back into the hole. It fell with a hiss and thud on his side, on his long red fur, the white feathers that grew between his toes, and his long, not to say aquiline, nose. We stood and brushed each other off. There are sorrows much keener than these. Silent the rest of the day, we worked, ate, stared and slept. It stormed all night. Now it clears, and a robin burbles from a dripping bush, like the neighbor who means well, but always says the wrong thing. So she describes what a lot of us have been through, burying a pet. Um, but she uses imagery to evoke the emotions of it and the sweet sadness of it. And almost every line in the poem is an image. And it's interesting to note which lines are not images. We buried the cat with his bowl. Barehanded, we scraped sand and gravel back into the hole. Now that's tactile imagery. You could maybe feel that and imagine the dirt under your fingernails, as they're filling in the hole. And then we have auditory imagery. It fell with a hiss and thud on his side. Can't you hear that? And then we have some visual imagery on his long red fur, the white feathers that grew between his toes. And obviously feathers is a metaphor because this cat does not have feathers. I assume, but the hairs, that the type of the long-haired cat, that long hair between their toes could look like a feather. And his long nose. We stood and brushed each other off, which is kind of an image. You can see that. There are sorrows much keener than these. No image there. That's all an idea. And compared, because it's in the midst of all these images, it's like one big flower around lots of smaller ones. It makes us think there are sorrows much keener or, much sharper than these. Meaning that, they're suffering all over the world and people die. And this is just a cat, but, the poem seems to say, but here I am feeling it. And a little farther down, it stormed all night, now it clears, and a robin burbles from a dripping bush. Can't you hear that? The raindrops dripping from the bush and the robin burbling, making that robin sound, which sounds like water, so there's another metaphor. And a robin burbles from a dripping bush, like the neighbor who means well but always says the wrong thing. And those last two lines, no images again, just a simile. The robin sounds, the happiness of the robin is like the neighbor who means well but always says the wrong thing. Meaning they're not happy to hear the beautiful robin this morning because there's still the sadness from burying the cat. So in your poem, does the poem you chose have a lot of imagery, or is it all abstract ideas? And if it's mainly imagery, which lines leave the imagery behind and say things? That contrast may have been put there by the poet for a reason, and you can talk about that in your poem. In your paper. So a lot of imagery is visual and auditory, what we see and what we hear, but some of it is tactile too. And I was reminded of this poem, Robert Frost's poem, Apple Picking, in which this one section describes, well, I'll just read it. My instep, the arch of your foot, my instep arch not only keeps the ache, it keeps the pressure of a ladder round. I feel the ladder sway as the boughs bend, and I keep hearing from the cellar bin the rumbling sound of load on load of apples coming in. So he's tired from all day of apple picking, and he can still feel the ladder's rung, that round rung on the arch of his foot. So that's tactile imagery. In section VC, we have Chanel and Giancarlo have already explicated similes in the poem I posted by E.E. Cummings, Somewhere I Have Never Traveled Gladly Beyond, which is a hard poem. But they went to, out of all the lines, they went right to the similes as a way to start to understand the poem. The poet says, your slightest look easily will unclose me, though I have closed myself as fingers. And as I think it was Chanel said, if you close your fingers, you have a fist. So he's saying emotionally I was as closed as a fist. But you open always petal by petal myself as spring opens her first rose. There we have a rose again. So the metaphors go from tight fist to a rose opening. What a beautiful relationship he's describing. So simile, metaphor, and image are elements you can explicate in essay number 2. Oh, another bonus point thing I thought of, Robert Frost's poem Apple Picking, and the link to it is in the text of the lecture. It's a much longer poem than the bit that I looked at here. So if you want to read it closely and send me an email about metaphors, similes, and imagery in it, I can give you some bonus points. Okay, thanks for listening, and I look forward to seeing essay number 2. And I want to say with essay number 1, we did small groups. With essay number 2, we're just going to do a group of the whole. And so hopefully everyone will get feedback on their rough draft. There's already a thread in week 7 for you to post a rough draft or a rough intro or whatever you have, and I'll be reading those and giving you lots of feedback. Okay, thanks.